Greetings, friends. Another session, another installment of the world famous AIOCS conversations. We just started this series, of course, and I'm happy to see the enthusiasm out there for this series. The first session ever recorded in this series was with my guest's colleague and friend, the Reverend Associate Professor Glen O'Brien. And it is with great pleasure and with great honor that I introduce to you the Reverend Dr Arseny Ermakov from the same Eva Burrows College with the University of Divinity in Melbourne. And I'd like to share with you his profile page at the college. Arseny is a senior lecturer there who studied in many places: St. Petersburg in Russia, the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He has a PhD from the University of Manchester in the United Kingdoms. So he has seen the world and has training in a number of places, which I assume left a mark upon his career, his interests, his approach to a variety of topics. And as you can see on his profile page, he's very much interested in holiness and purity. And you will see that he already edited a volume together with a colleague on purity, Essays in Bible and Theology in 2014. And more recently, he has published an important commentary on the Gospel of Matthew in the Wesleyan tradition, 2019. In other words, what we are dealing with today is a biblical scholar, which is quite interesting, thinking of the fact that the reason for which I invited Arseny to speak to us today is his contribution to a suite of 3 course units delivered together with Glen O'Brien on futurism. On this note, I turn to Arseny, whom I welcome wholeheartedly and invite him to say a few words about himself and about this exciting venture, transhumanism, futurism, and so on and so forth. Welcome again.
Thank you, Father Doru. It's a pleasure to be here and have just a conversation about those things. And of course, as you can see from my profile, I'm just a kind of an aficionado, a kind of amateur in the area of futurism and theology and science and theology kind of thing. So it's more like a kind of a personal interest, a curiosity of sort. Yeah, so I was kind of born and bred in the USSR. And of course, that's quite an interesting place to be in the sense that I'm recalling from my youth that there was kind of a drive for space exploration, that kind of an interest in other worlds and the Soviet sci-fi that you've been reading or watching Soviet cartoons that are about space travel and all of that stuff.
I know a lot about it. Romanian.
Yeah, so that's kind of for me, it's in a sense going back to some sort of a childhood memories and recapturing some of those. And yeah, so here at Eva Burrows College, my colleague Glen and I, we kind of collaborated and designed a kind of a suite of units that address that issue about futurism and theology. And so that's been We run now 2 out of 3. And so, yes, it was quite an interesting experience, and I'm looking forward to talk more about that.
That's amazing. As a matter of fact, I have to confess this, and I interrupted you earlier out of enthusiasm, of course. The fact that as a child and even as a teenager, I kept reading very interesting Russian sci-fi. I can't recall now names of authors, but I remember that in Romania, many such works were translated, and the Russian masters featured in collections together with the grand masters of the West of sci-fi and popular science also. Popular science. That's very interesting. So I can see where you come from. You are a biblical scholar with deep roots in popular science and sci-fi, the way I'm a patristic scholar with deep roots in sci-fi and popular science. Because, but see, this is very interesting. It shows something about our background, where we grew up. It was that culture, so much effervescence, there was so much positivity about research and discovery, and we'll conquer the solar system and the universe and so on and so forth. And there you go. We took these very different parts, Christian theology of a sort of or another, and yet what we grew up with is still within us and drawing us towards matters of science and faith and popular science, and wanted to make sense of the universe and reality, and why are we here, and so on and so forth. So how does this complex background translate into your contribution to this suite of courses? Has anything of your upbringing come to the fore during this course? Have you shared with your students, for instance, your personal story? That would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I started kind of regaining interest in that area after kind of reading on the news that in Russia, a political party appeared that was called Evolution 2045. And so that political party with that name actually put transhumanist agenda into politics. So they put on their political agenda achieving immortality by 2045. Oh, so by means of uploading, yes, by means of uploading your mind and personality to the machine. So this is a quite an interesting, but of course, I mean, if you know the Russian history and philosophy, it's not something new. It's been already in Russia. It's a new iteration of what's been happening since actually the beginning and the end, in the beginning of at the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, with such a kind of a cosmist like Nikolai Fedorov and his ideas. Of course, then they picked up by his disciple Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who actually was one of the first who would, explore the possibility of travel into space. And then, of course, Sergei Korolev, who was the mastermind behind the Soviet space program. So this is a kind of and so those ideas about immortality, about space travel, about, of course, for Nikolai Fedorov, it's actually all rooted in orthodoxy. He was
that's interesting. How come?
So he was Orthodox, and so for him, these ideas of immortality, of death, of resurrection is coming out of Christianity, or this living, going into space, exploring space for him as what it's all the kind of a bigger picture of the world, and of course then this is how kind of ended up with Tsiolkovsky saying yes, the Earth is the cradle of humanity, but you can't stay in a cradle forever. Or one can't stay in the cradle. So it's all kind of a set. And so this kind of a, it's been, of course, picked up in the Soviet time, but of course, in the Soviet time, they didn't want to hear about orthodox roots of it or orthodox ideas. So it's more about, space travel on kind of a more materialistic way. But all of that has been rooted there. And now it's a kind of a, it's coming back in a sense, but it came in a funny, in an interesting way when the transhumanism is not just a set of philosophical ideas or just a set kind of a instructions for scientists to follow. It's actually turned into a political agenda. Oh, let's turn the state as the machine to advance that agenda. Let's state will bring immortality to everybody in this way and that way. So yeah, that's kind of caught my interest. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So these things are happening. And what also kind of caught my attention that those people, of course, they reached out to Russian scientists, but also reached out to religious communities. And so they invited to religious leaders for a dialogue and see how, and it of course fits very well into what Nikolai Fyodorov from the beginning was the religious roots of that kind of ideas. And so regaining, so this idea is, yes, technological advancement, but also kind of a spiritual betterment of humanity. These things are coming together. And so that's also, oh, that's interesting. And of course, I mean, if you look particularly in the Western transhumanism, it seems more kind of a leaning towards Oriental religions. They are more interested in Buddhism and the life of the mind and all these practices. For some reason, having kind of a negative view of Christianity. But I mean, if you look at the monastic tradition, Orthodox tradition, mystical traditions, it's very much, I mean, I think in the West, they're kind of overlooking that, or kind of, I don't know, overreacting towards the Christianity or domination of Christianity in the West, and, kind of not paying much attention to it. But when in Russia, it seems that they're kind of more open to that kind of, and reaching out to Orthodox. But of course, there's a different ways how it played out, but still. So this kind of a thing kind of led me, oh, okay, that'd be interesting in our environment, because I belong to evangelical tradition. Yes, I know I'm Russian, but I'm not Orthodox, I'm evangelical. That's a bit strange piece, but anyway. So I thought, well, how it's gonna work out in our evangelical tradition, how we bring reflections on those things, since others are doing that and engaging with that, and how we can bring those kind of a conversation outside of the kind of theological circles and philosophical circles, technological circles into theological classroom. And so that'd be an interesting way of engaging it, but do it in not kind of in a traditional mode that you have who's one lecturer and who is the specialist in the topic. And so you just bathing in wisdom of that. Just Glen and I think Glen mentioned that Glen and I, we're not professionals in that sense. He is a historian and I'm a biblical scholar, but we wanted to approach that issue interdisciplinary. So I wanted to have a look how different disciplines looking at the same issue, how they integrate their knowledge. And of course, because we are kind of aficionados, we wanted to invite those who are specialists into our classroom. So how we can have this interdisciplinary dialogue around those issues, around the issues of emerging technologies and how those emerging technologies affecting society, how they're affecting religion, how they're affecting culture, how they're affecting philosophy. So we want to explore that and bring those kind of voices, philosophical voice, technological voice, cultural voice, in the conversation with Christian tradition. And so that's kind of our kind of idea. Yeah, so my kind of a role there would be kind of bringing that perhaps a biblical voice, a scholar who's done some studies in the Bible, and perhaps there is something that we could shed light on. But yeah, returning to a question, no, I don't think I've shared any kind of a personal question, personal testimony how I got to that yet, but maybe at some point it will come to that as well. So yeah, my role is kind of being, yeah, co-teacher, co-lecturer, or better probably we're kind of changing a model, going from a lecturer to more kind of seeing ourselves as facilitators of student learning experiences. So how we can facilitate it, how we inviting students into a conversation with other voices and kind of guiding through that. So that's kind of a model we are pursuing, and yeah, that's my kind of a contribution.
That's amazing, you know, because I find myself in a very similar position. Well, from time to time, I am given the opportunity to teach, of course, in a sort of patristic setting, matters of science and faith, or science and theology. And usually I begin by saying, look, I'm no scientist. I don't have any scientific training, but yes, I'm very much interested in knowing things and in making sense of the world, our purpose on earth in this life, and also a matter of, you know, integrating information from a variety of sources within my worldview. And I find myself usually in the same kind of situation, you know, where I'm not expert, not even in science and theology. Although some people would associate me with science and theology, every time I'm given this opportunity, I say, well, I'm not. And my readings in the exciting field of science and religion are quite limited. Yeah, well, look, I went through a number of great books and so on and so forth, but I can't say that my methodology, my approach is shaped by um, what's what and who's who in the field. And I believe that this is very interesting, and your undertaking from this viewpoint is very appealing to me, because I believe that even for people like us, say outsiders, in terms of the actual field, um, we might have something to contribute. You know, we bring something fresh, a new perspective, coming at the table with our own expertise and our own interests and so on and so forth. And I think in a world like ours, this should be the norm. You know, instead of having there, you know, only the experts talking, without, of course, crossing the boundaries of decency. It's important for all of us to contribute, especially because, as you pointed out already, we live in a very complex world where we Christians face a number of challenges. And we need to be prepared, not just to answer, because that's usually the apologetic approach. We have to respond, we have to answer, we have to refute. I don't think that's the case. First of all, we need to understand, and undertakings like yours and Glen's are very significant, very important, regardless of the setting. You said, oh, I'm a Russian, that's not Orthodox. What a shame. Look, we are people who love God. We are people who are committed to the gospel. And we live in this world where there's so much confusion, actually. And usually confusion comes from ignorance, from lack of information. And I believe that this is where even voices like ours, not coming from a science and religion background or a scientific background, we can be of service as facilitators, as you said, to people who might depend on us for some kind of guidance. And from this viewpoint, I think the fact that you mentioned a few masters of the scientific revolution in modern Russia is very significant. You know, we well, that's what we do. We build on the shoulders of giants. Yeah, and the fact that we bring something, our even our tiny, humble perspective is still important. What would be a biblical approach to matters of futurism, technological advancement, challenges related to human transformation, transhumanism, and so on and so forth? Is there a solid biblical foundation for this kind of discussion?
Well, that's a great question, and probably one of the hardest ones. I feel like if you look at the scripture, that the sacred story, the history of technology and the sacred story, it seems to kind of going in a way in a parallel. They intersect, but the sacred story and techno story a bit different, particularly if you compare it to mythology that comes to us from Greeks or other cultures, where the story of technology is connected to the story of the gods, where you got, Hephaestus, who is the god inventor. He invents stuff, and gives the technology. We have stories of the origin of the technologies that are there. So we kind of, ancient Greeks, it seems to be fascinated, and kind of their imagination is fired by some of that, and they connect that to divine straight away. Where of course scripture is a little bit different. We don't particularly know where technology coming from. There is no stories that tell us that Yahweh is giving, together with the tablets of the covenant, he gives the instructions for smelting or creating a tools or something like that. So we don't have that origin story for technologies. But what happens, I think, they come into fold at certain points in the biblical story. They intersect with the sacred story. For example, when we talk about in Exodus 32, I think, where they talking about the creation of the tabernacle. And there you have that, the whole passage about this, gifted man who has got this, techne, he got the wisdom and knowledge and the spirit to build that stuff, to use the technology. And so this kind of, it comes, and here this connected technology is very much connected to worship and divine presence and how you kind of accommodate that. And so I think this is an interesting intersection. But also, of course, as you travel through, perhaps the technology comes kind of on the background. There's a kind of a silent presence that is there. It's not like a spoken, explicitly, but it's there. You say, let's talk about crucifixion, and the crucifix is a result of technology. It's a product of technology, cruel technology, but it is a technology. So you talk about Eucharist, for example, and the celebration and the bread and wine. These are the products of technology. So it meets at this point, for me, interestingly, I'm just looking at that, at the points of kind of our salvation story and a sacred story. They probably go in parallel, but they meet at some crucial stages, perhaps, we can argue. And it's a part of the human domain. Yeah, it seems that it's something that the humans are doing, and the humans having wisdom. But also I'm starting to think, when in Exodus 32, when God talks about, and Moses talks about that person who has a wisdom. And here's the interesting clue, of course, when you talk about wisdom, where is the source of wisdom? And perhaps it's not just a technology, it's not just coming out of humans, but actually it's also a wisdom divine, perhaps. So maybe there are kind of a connection. So we don't have that kind of explicit connections that we find in Greco-Roman mythology, but perhaps these are mediated via these ideas of wisdom, of divine wisdom that is kind of given to humans, but also perhaps it coming out of that idea of creativity, that we as the humans, as the image of God, has that because God is creator, and we are given that mandate to create, and that's what happens with the crafts, with technology. We are who are creators, so they reflecting that the image of God. So perhaps there is a kind of a foundation for it. But of course, there's another interesting issue talking about the mythologies and where the things coming from. We find that one of the stories in one Enoch. In one Enoch, there is a story of these fallen angels coming down to earth, and they're revealing secrets of heaven to humans, and they're giving them knowledge of pharmacology and metallurgy. So how to smelt metals and stuff. So this coming from these fallen angels. So it's quite an interesting story and fascinating story. So your technology, some of your technology is having evil roots. They're coming from angels who've fallen from heaven. And of course, that sets kind of a very, sometimes a sectarian trend of attitudes towards technology, of a suspicion of technology that corrupts humanity. And so that's actually strands that you find, and I'm not sure, I'm not a expert in patristic, but I think some of the fathers speak some of the moral arguments on building on Enoch and on that particular story in Watchers. But it's all connected with corruptibility and what's been done. So some secret knowledge being revealed, but it's not for the good of humanity. And actually brings the corruption, like, what you do with gold. What you do. Sorry.
Okay, so we are back to our conversation.
Yeah, so returning to Book of Watchers and also the kind of a revelation of this knowledge that are probably heavenly, but also revealed by evil and the fallen angels. And so that argument that sets a certain attitudes towards technology. So on the one hand, you have that positive attitude. It's a part of creativity. It's a part of being human, using that for all sorts of things. On the other hand, there's a kind of a darker side to technology that could corrupt, that could bring some sort of those kind of tendencies or highlight those tendencies within a society. So yes, that could be probably where I'm at this point in thinking about it. But of course, I mean, the whole module is just going beyond the technology, because it talks about other like we talk about post-humanism, for example, or we talk about artificial intelligence and possibility of artificial intelligence and how you're gonna interact with other mind rather than human. But of course, from biblical perspective, in the sense that actually humans been interacting with other minds for centuries. It's not something new. There are angelic beings, there are other minds, there are spirits, spirit world, there are other minds that you can have a conversation with. And so that experience of ancients actually can be brought into now. It's only probably post-enlightenment that we imagine that it's only our minds, so we can only talk to human minds. But actually, humans been talking to different minds for centuries. So how can that conversation contribute to our thinking about artificial intelligence and how we're going to interact with that mind?
That's amazing.
Of course, another issue for going back to post-humanism, that idea that humans did not the center of the universe, for me as a biblical scholar, though, yeah, it's the ancient world that was been, the humans never been the centers of things. And so we kind of almost, for me, it's a post-humanist return is a kind of okay, it's a new antiquity. Yeah, we all been there. The humans, for the most of its history, have been post-human in a sense. That they weren't the center of the universe. And so how to recapture that Christian tradition and Christian wisdom that is there. Again, as we mentioned before, the Christian spiritual practices that can help us in the modern way of living, and how we can recapture those things, how we can affect them. So for me, as a biblical scholar, yeah, to capture those ancient voices and bring them forward. Or thinking of, for example, of a holistic approach to creation, what post-humanists are trying to do. Oh yeah, that's the biblical world. This is our world, and divine being together. So how we can understand this thing? So yeah, along those lines, I think. So it's more than just a kind of a insights into technology, but also it's about other aspects. Talking about immortality, for example, Scripture has a lot to say about that, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's plenty of things to explore.
That's amazing, really. I mean, I wanted to stop you a few times, but I think it's very important that that you reach this point, because now we have a broader and quite complex viewpoint as to how Christians who have a background in the scriptures might actually interact creatively, you know, without fearing with the various advancements within our own technological civilization. I'd like to return to a point you made earlier. Actually, a couple of them maybe. One of them about the Eucharist, which you aptly equated with, well, it's a sacred gesture. We all are familiar with, Christians, and it involves technology. I believe that what you at least gave me there is the idea of a saved, redesigned, reconceived, reused technology. The Eucharist becomes not only the sacred experience of our fellowship with God and our the fellow believers. It's also an indication as to how we could put technology to the good service of the gospel, for instance, of our faith, and instead of fearing technology, we should understand it and we should consider its positive applications, because that's one of the things that even many Christians do, unfortunately. They look at the negative side of things, the dark side of technology. And this brings me back to another point that you made in relation to the origin of technology, and that somehow in scriptures, canonical and apocryphal, there might be some indication that the source of technology, industry, and so on and so forth might be suspicious or seem suspicious to us. And this reminded me actually of it's not a story. It's something that happened in the 7th century with my favorite author, Saint Maximus the Confessor. Wrote a very interesting narrative about everything, or at least many things. And within this narrative, he addressed metaphorically the topic of the spiritual life and, well, let's call it technology or civilization. At least from my viewpoint, what challenged him to address this topic, so 7th century, is the fact that there was a rift that has become apparent between the monastic circles, which he represented. So he was a monk, where many monks refused technology, refused to bring themselves up to date with whatever was available at the time. Mind you, to this day, certain monasteries refuse to use electricity and other things for whatever our usual amenities, and they consider this a kind of spiritual resistance against what might seem to be evil. And this gives a very wrong idea to many believers who look at the monastic representatives or the representatives of the monastic movement as I don't know, a standard for the Christian life. Maximus, a monk himself, was of a different view. he said, well, we should bridge paradise, or the paradise, and the inhabited world, the world of civilization, society, innovation, research, discovery, and so on and so forth. That was the other thing, that the other phenomenon that he noticed in the so-called secular or lay world. There was less and less interesting in spirituality. So on the one hand, you have the monastic life, which is very spiritual and interested in spiritual stuff, but not too much in the world of today, so to speak. On the other hand, you have the secular city where there isn't much sense of spirituality. And as Maximus said, well, this should be brought together, and he contemplated the life of Christ as bridging the paradisal or spiritual life. This is why I said metaphorical. The paradisal life or spiritual life and the inhabited world of technology, science, civilization, and so on and so forth. So the topic is old, and I go with you. I found very refreshing what you said from a biblical viewpoint about the possibility of pinpointing not only suspicious sources of technology, but also a way of transforming technology and putting it to the good use in a Christian sense. This somehow brings to a deeper foundation what I already knew about Maximus the Confessor and his idea of how important it is to bridge these worlds of spirituality and technology. Which brings me to the next topic. You are very much interested, and I have to say this personal now, a personal moment. First time I met Arseny long ago when he became a member of the Sydney College of Divinity at the time, faculty member. He was very much interested in purity, the project that now we know after we visited his profile, he brought to a conclusion. Would this topic of purity, or we can say seeking a spiritual life, would it inform us, or could it inform us Christians in terms of how to approach technology? And I'm thinking of the recurrent topic of ethical consideration. That's what we hear from various Christian organizations. Well, yes, technology is important, research important, but we need to be mindful of ethical criteria. Honestly, I don't quite use this term, this phrase, ethical criteria, because of the very volatile and confusing sometimes idea of ethics. Ethics might mean many things. How about the topic of purity? Can it have an impact on how we approach, how we think, how we use technology?
Well, that's another good question. Well, after that, remind me, I have a question for you. After responding to that, I have a question for you. Purity. I think there are a few avenues, I suppose, that we can answer that question. On the one hand, is quite a practical one, and particularly when we get in the time of pandemic, suddenly everybody wants to be friends with the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were washing their hands, they were abstaining from clean people, they were eating only kosher food. So they created a community, what they call a bubble. So they lived in that bubble of purity. And so that's an example to aspire to. But of course, we as Christians, we don't want to aspire to that example, because of course, Jesus is the one who's been touching and being touched. And this is, of course, no in our society. But of course, what the Jesus does is he reaches out to marginalize and bring them to the center of things. And that's what I think in the time of pandemic, we probably need to not to forget of those people who actually suffering during this pandemic and who have been marginalized because of these whatever economical conditions being created and so on. So not to dehumanize, I think that's the call of Christ would be, those who have been affected by it and not excluded. So purity it's a kind of a weird thing in a sense. It's a very interesting category that, of course, in the modern world, what the Pharisees practice as we call the religious purity, and it has nothing to do with hygiene in a sense. It's a very different sense of miasma and pollution that comes from these different sources. But of course, in our post-Enlightenment world, the purity didn't really disappear. Religious purity in the Western world more or less disappeared. It turned into a category of moral thing. That's what you're aiming at, the moral kind of being pure, being holy, being ethically, perfect. And on the other hand, it turned the purity still had, because it has also darker side, is a racial purity, for example, that we find in the 19th century, beginning of 20th century. So the purity becomes a very dangerous category. And so it's a category that divides, it's them and us category. So to use that kind of that particular category, or it became also a kind of a very disenchanted category. We talk about chemical purities, or we talk about medicinal purity. Now we need to practice. You need to wash your hands, not for religious purposes, but for that kind of a purity. So avoid being contagious, or all of that stuff. So in terms of kind of how we navigate this language of purity, and it's a hard one, really, because on the other hand, it's a very dangerous language. On the other hand, is that the language that is sometimes picked up by transhumanists, because the kind of a spiritual betterment is you are turning into a perfect something. Perhaps you can turn into a perfect moral agent. For example, if we do tweak your DNA, maybe we can, tweak sinful nature out of it. If we manage, so what does that is these technologies the means of salvation, of betterment of humanity, and so in that sense, it's like, oh, okay, this is something else that's going on here, and so in terms of can purity help us? But I think the Christian ideal, this life set towards holiness, it's probably holiness. I would prefer that language perhaps better, because of reflective of divine holiness, and probably I think that's I think that Jesus would probably also see it better with that language rather than the purity, that the holiness that is. That drawing in, that transformative, that is kind of taking us to the divine ideal. And I think I find here kind of a resonating with early church fathers here. And that's path of not perhaps not just a kind of a theological embodiment, but this is kind of a path of spiritual, or that is coming out of this deep relationship with the divine, rather than just a reliance on pure technology in that sense. So I think definitely a Christian tradition in the language of holiness and purity sets us to that, on that path, saying that yes, technology, we need to pay attention, yet it is important, but it's not it's not the way of salvation for us as in Christian tradition. Mm.
Okay, so I must have misunderstood your research into purity, and I should have qualified this word, or the way I use this word, because that's my idea of integrating whatever things our civilization produces into that broader perspective, which is basically theological, of holiness, or of living a holy life. And of course, even here, this word might be in need of clarification, as you pointed out, because for some people, holiness is to stay away from everything.
Exactly.
That's the monastic attitude that St. Maximus the Confessor fought. Yeah, stay away from everything, because everything that doesn't have to do with the spiritual life is evil and irredeemable. You know, and of course that's not what we are talking about here. But we're seeking, I assume, both you and I, we're seeking ways in which we Christians, for instance, can make sense of technology, technological advance, and so on and so forth, in a sense that doesn't actually interfere negatively with our life. And maybe from the viewpoint of this perspective of holiness, purity, spirituality, whatever you want to call it, we should look at how to transform whatever we touch, whatever we use, whatever we employ even for the betterment of our lives. Now, would you say that in a scriptural perspective, betterment by way of technological aids is something that should be avoided, or something that is legitimate?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think we just kind of started. Oh, for example, now in our class we talked about application of virtue ethics to robotics. So can we design a robot that actually teaches human to be a virtuous? Can we design a virtuous robot that teaches humans to behave virtually? So can that robot set us on the path to holiness? Can your algorithm and behaviors and attitudes that is creating a righteous machine? That is an example to the faithful. So this is bringing kind of a holiness and purity into robotics. And so can there's a betterment of humanity? Of course, I mean, we've been using technology for that for ages, and that's it seems to be the whole point of technology is making human lives easier, better. It's probably one of those kind of parts of our brain that, you know, finding the easiest way to accomplish a task, and so probably technology is coming out of our laziness and brain's desire to conserve energy, but in any case, it's always been there, and so betterment of our human, of course. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, in the Christian tradition that precludes that. But of course, there is also fine line: is that technology going to replace relationship with technology? Going to replace your relationship with the divine? And that's what the problematic is. So can you know, if you just kind of subscribing to pure materialistic worldview of the universe and say, well, that's what it is. And of course, there's only way of salvation. There's only mechanized way of salvation through science and pathways. But for us, I think that's not the holistic view of the universe. And so the humans, they're not just a kind of a biological machines. They belong to a wider context and wider relationships. And relationship with the divine is one of those. And so religion will play a role in that, and because it is a part of human, that what adds to human well-being. And so how we bring into that, and so that's what you're doing, I think is important, bringing that conversation between science and technology with theology is a quite important one. So how we see those patterns, how we do these things together, how we use those technologies for the good purposes, for the betterment of humanity in all sorts of ways. And that actually brings me to the question I wanted to ask you. I've been thinking about looking at the biblical material where worship and technology are coming together. It seems that the worship is facilitated or ushered in by the means of technology. Because you're talking about the building of the tent of meeting. That's the space, that's the sanctuary created by using technology. We're going back to Eucharist. And I think in every context, in the context of Orthodox Church, in the context of low evangelicals, when we celebrate Eucharist, we use the technology. It's not only in production of bread and wine. I like this Anglican prayer, fruit of the vine and work of human hands, which will become for us the cup of salvation. So there's a nature and technology coming together, but they celebrate the divine presence with us. So these are the things. And of course, as you enter evangelical church or Orthodox church, what we are surrounded by products of technology in everything. You take a cup is made out of clay or it is made out of gold. There's a technology involved. Of course, it's a mastery, it's an art, but it's a technology. You take evangelical worship, take a guitars or whatever, pulpit. It's art. It's a technology involved. So we've been using technology for facilitating connection with divine for as long as humanity existed. It's there. So and it's there in our Christian tradition. My question to you: so you as a celebrant of the communion, would you appreciate having an assistant or maybe a celebrant with artificial intelligence? So say, peace be with you, and he and she or it replies to you, and with you also. Or what do you think about that?
Wow. I didn't see this one coming. I should ask you first to answer that question. Quite interesting, but if I may be a bit Byzantine.
Of course, absolutely.
And take the back door as things would do with girls, absolutely, and so on and so forth. I'd say that for the time being, I don't have that problem. When I give you this very evasive answer, it's not a matter of not having an opinion. Yeah. It's just a matter of saying that, for instance, if we look at the history of the church, at least in its Byzantine iteration, answers usually have been given in the past, and for more than a millennium actually, answers have been given to things that were there, existed. So from this viewpoint, I'm quite free and free to navigate until there's something there to deal with. For example, this is common history for us, yeah, for all Christians. In the 4th century, it has become unbearable for the church. The fact that certain people, self-styled Christians, ceased to believe that Jesus was true God incarnate. Yeah. Okay. The church has never issued before a statement about the divinity of Christ. Why? Because no one actually, considered mainstream Christian, no one would actually doubt Christ's divinity. And then when the problem occurred, the church gathered, bishops gathered, and so on and so forth. They debated, they discussed, they brought common testimony, and they managed to reach a consensus. This is what we have been given by the apostles, and this is what we believe, that Jesus is God. Okay, fine. For many people, the fact that a statement, an official Christian statement on Christ's divinity was issued only in the 4th century is like an innovation. Yeah. But from my viewpoint, this is wisdom. We deal with a topic when there's a challenge that is addressed to us, and we have to deal with it. We don't have to hypothesize. So from this viewpoint, I can be very Byzantine and say, look, I don't have to give you any answer, Arseny. but thank you for your very friendly and challenging question. Because it's not there. Now, if I return to being myself, I would say that, of course, if first of all, if we have that artificial intelligence, and if we scrutinize that artificial intelligence and we decide, I'm open to this possibility, and we decide that at some point that artificial intelligence has become an intelligence that is, I don't know, matching ourselves, then I'll have to consider very seriously the possibility of integrating intelligent machines in the congregation. Do we preach the gospel to them, first of all? Can they make moral decisions? Can they show all the signs of discipleship? And if they can do that, so what prevents us from acknowledging the fact that that's a possibility? But again, this is, from my viewpoint now, it's sci-fi. I haven't seen that artificial intelligence that embraces the gospel of the Lord, walks in the footsteps of the Lord, is able to sacrifice itself for the sake of others, for the love of others. But if I can see that, then I can be confused and then challenged to answer the question. So that's me. The other part of me, the official me, says, well, we don't have the problem. Then I'm spared the effort of giving you an answer. How would you answer this one, for instance? Answer your own question. What would you do? The way you see things now, from the viewpoint of where you are at now.
Well, I don't know. That's why I've been asking you.
Well, so you're more Byzantine than
no, there's a good question to consider, I suppose. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we far away from machines that are self-aware, let alone things. But for example, in Japan, is in one of the Shinto temples, there is a robot priest who reads the prayers and reads some sutras, I think, and recites the scripture and so on and so forth. Of course, a very primitive kind of a bot. There is a artificial kind of a, based on artificial intelligence algorithm, a Catholic chatbot that you can talk to, and it could pray with you and, you know, read the scripture with you, and so there are some attempts to do that, but of course they're very primitive. So it's not, we are far away from, I think, for any kind of a real artificial intelligence. But attempts have been made. But it's an interesting question, of course, for me. I mean, of course, you're absolutely right. It's a sci-fi at this point. And we asked that same question. So we invited, into our class, we invited a specialist from America who works on artificial intelligence. And we asked the same question. So what did you do if your artificial intelligence machine asks for communion? And he said, I will turn it off and check the code. What's went wrong there? That's a professional answer to that question.
Yeah. No, look, of course we can do that too. But no, hypothesizing again. So if that machine proves not only self-awareness, but a capacity for self-sacrifice out of love for someone, that's the most Christ-like criterion ever. I do not expect anything less from myself or anyone who calls themselves Christians or human beings. So the capacity to love, truly, not mimic to whatever programmed responses, you know, that's for me the most Christ-like thing ever. Of course, going back to some good Isaac Asimov robot stories or novels, you know, their prime directive is not to cause harm to people.
Yeah.
But I don't remember in the robot novels, or maybe there are some examples of robots who sort of kill themselves for the sake of a human being. Bad example. So Asimov already gave us a very Christian answer to what makes a robot worthy, not only of prayer, but also of sitting in fellowship with the saints at the Lord's table.
Yes, those actually algorithms.
You confuse me completely.
Those algorithms already, some of them been used in self-driving cars. So who are you going to hit or not to hit or whatever? You know, that's the famous dilemma. You hit one person or you hit many, you know. So these are quite an interesting question. So they're already, some of them being programmed in. So these are quite interesting questions, how you program behaviors and moral decisions. This is, yeah, anyway, fascinating.
Wow, that was amazing, really, Arseny. And now we have to close this conversation with more questions than we had earlier, at least from my viewpoint. But you know, I'm grateful because if everything would be so clear, life would be so boring. So I gratefully acknowledge my debt to you for this conversation, for your time, and for these open questions. And if among those who will be watching this recording, there's a true interest in the topic, please allow me to kindly ask them to enroll in your units to learn how to handle these matters. Yeah. So
thank you. Father Doru, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you and discuss all the things. Aficionado to aficionado. Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Much appreciated. All the best.